Welcome everyone. It's our fourth session of the workshop titled Today Configurations and Dynamics of Entrepreneurial Ecosystems. We have four great speakers. We have Michaela, we have Fumi with your colleague, we have Yana and Yasuyuki towards the end of the workshop. And in between presentation 2 and 3, we will have a 10-minute break. Hopefully we will manage to get 10 minutes. If not, it may be around 5, 6, something like that. We're going to plan to finish at 5 o'clock. And after 5 o'clock, as in the past 2 sessions, we'll try to do a networking session again on Zoom. Some people have enjoyed it, and hopefully we can repeat that and make Zoom work for us again. Okay, so if you just one organizational matter, if you wish to ask questions after the presentation, and each presentation will take 15 minutes, and there will be hopefully around 10 minutes for questions left, please raise your hand in Zoom. For that option, I know that you need to have an updated Zoom. So please do that. And then that's pretty much it. For all the speakers, I will let you know around 2 to 3 minutes before 15 minutes by intervening with my voice, because there's no other way to let you know actually. So apologies for the disruption that you will have, but that way you will know about the timing. Unless I can see that you're coming to finishing your presentation, then I may just decide not to disrupt you. Okay, without any further talking from me, let's give the floor or Zoom to Michaela and her presentation.
Thank you very much, Dan, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm trying to load up my presentation. Hopefully you can see the full view. Great, thanks for nodding, Dan. Much appreciated. Okay, good afternoon. My name is Michaela Hruskova, and I am a lecturer in entrepreneurship at the University of Stirling, and I'm also currently finishing my PhD at the University of Glasgow. And today I have a short presentation about a bit of an accidental finding from my PhD about the ambiguous and fragmented nature of the Scottish entrepreneurial ecosystem, or maybe it's ecosystems, spoiler alert. So let's get started. Entrepreneurial ecosystems, as we all know, are generally environments that are supportive of entrepreneurial activity. So I also very much look at them as a set of different interconnected actors, organizations, institutions, and processes that collectively promote and support entrepreneurial activity. Now, what we know from the literature is that we often look at ecosystems as a macro level phenomenon. So we look at them in a holistic manner, and rightfully so, but there is some existing recognition of the fact that actually there are some multi-level dynamics in ecosystems, and we might even have nested ecosystems, a bit along the lines of the Russian doll metaphor. And as we know from the work of, for instance, Christina Teodoraki and colleagues, there is such a concept as a meso-level ecosystem. And specifically, Christina has looked at an entrepreneurial support ecosystem, and others have looked at the startup incubation ecosystem. And we then also know that if we look at it from a micro-level perspective, some individual ecosystem actors, such as incubators, can also be seen as ecosystems in and of themselves. And that's a little bit of the perspective I'm looking at. So it's the different levels of ecosystems. But before I get to the data itself, just to bring us all on board in terms of the different ecosystem stakeholders, these are generally any individual or organizational actors who have an interest or a stake in promoting and supporting entrepreneurship in their local area. And we know that these ecosystem stakeholders are independent. So this means they're autonomous, and these are stakeholders such as entrepreneurs, mentors, advisors, investors, universities, the government, etc. But they're also interconnected because these ecosystem actors interact on a regular basis. And finally, they are also interdependent. So the actions of one stakeholder may impact on others in the ecosystem. And what I'm trying to look at in my PhD is how are ecosystems and ecosystem stakeholders self-organized? So how are they governed? But what I would like to focus on today is actually just looking a little bit at the differences in how these different stakeholders understand and perceive the local entrepreneurial ecosystem. So how did I do that? In my PhD, I am undertaking a qualitative exploratory study. I did 51 different interviews with all the different representatives of ecosystem stakeholders. I initially started the study more by looking at the Edinburgh ecosystem here in Scotland, but inevitably it extended into more of a Scottish perspective because there's lots of debate going on about whether we have more of a city region ecosystem or a national ecosystem in Scotland, but that's a presentation for another day. And I collected my data in between spring and autumn 2019, which at this point feels like a lifetime ago. So by way of introducing the context, the ecosystem, for those of you who may not be familiar, like I said earlier, there is a bit of a debate going on between, do we have an Edinburgh ecosystem or a Scottish ecosystem? Well, Edinburgh is the capital city of Scotland, and it is very much the epicenter of entrepreneurial activity. We have pockets of entrepreneurial activity across Scotland, but it nevertheless converges in Edinburgh. So overall, Edinburgh has a maturing ecosystem because it has most of the important ecosystem components, including a supportive culture, a grassroots community of entrepreneurs, and a good overall kind of investment landscape for businesses. The other cities in Scotland, particularly Glasgow, for instance, have more of an emerging ecosystem. So there's some activity there, but not at the same level as in Edinburgh. And Edinburgh actually has had 2 unicorn success stories, Skyscanner and FanDuel. But if we actually consider Scotland as a whole, we can add a 3rd unicorn, which is brewery Brewdog from northeast of Scotland. So this is just a very brief introduction to the local context, and let's look at the data now. So when we look at this from a stakeholder perspective, well, the main finding, spoiler alert, is the fact that people use the same term, entrepreneurial ecosystem, but mean very different things. This suggests that the term ecosystem actually doesn't have a stable meaning. When I was talking to my informants, it actually became apparent. It took me a while, but I realized we can actually look at this from 6 different perspectives, and I will break this down one by one. But overall, this shows that we do have an overall entrepreneurial ecosystem, but we can also look at it from more of a sub-ecosystem perspective as well. And to make things even more complicated, a couple of informants admitted that they change the meaning of the word ecosystem depending on the context and the person they're speaking to. So this makes it incredibly difficult to understand what do we actually mean when we talk about ecosystems. So let's break down the 6 different perspectives now. The first one is the standard entrepreneurial ecosystem, and this is very much the holistic view of the full range of actors and stakeholders who play a role in promoting entrepreneurship. And this is very much consistent with the academic literature and the way most of us look at ecosystems. But the next one is actually what we can call the entrepreneurship support ecosystem. And this is essentially a grouping of different actors who play a role in promoting and supporting entrepreneurship. So this is very much entrepreneurship support organizations, which provide generalist entrepreneurship support. We also have professional service providers who provide subject matter expertise, such as lawyers or accountants. And we also have some element from the public sector, particularly through the enterprise agencies, and some involvement from corporate incubators or accelerators, but not corporates as a whole, but just the kind of entrepreneur-facing elements. And what's really fascinating is that actually this ecosystem is quite often considered to be the default ecosystem. So when I talk to informants and talk to them about the ecosystem, it actually turns out they mean this support infrastructure rather than the overall ecosystem. Next up is something I call the Scotland Can Do ecosystem, for lack of a better term, because it's essentially a subsection of the previous sub-ecosystem in that it is a very specific grouping of entrepreneurship support actors who are part of the Scotland Can Do movement. we have this movement in Scotland, which is essentially a vision for Scotland to become the most entrepreneurial nation in the world, whatever that means. And we have lots of organizations that subscribe to this vision and they're official partners. And they themselves have started talking about themselves as the ecosystem. So the term seems to be, in a way, hijacked from the entrepreneurship perspective, because it's very much the different providers of support. And in fact, this ecosystem even includes actors that we don't normally think about as much, such as city councils or skills development organizations. And part of this reason is that it seems to be a grouping of public sector funded actors and everybody who has any role that might be even tangential to entrepreneurship that gets involved in this movement. So the next ecosystem then that we can look at is the investor ecosystem. And the name probably says it all. It is very much a group of people who provide investment for entrepreneurs. And this is the usual business angels, but also venture capitalists, and to some degree, the public sector co-investment scheme that we have in Scotland. There's also a tangential involvement from universities because they provide a pipeline of entrepreneurs and intellectual property. We have professional service providers, such as lawyers and accountants, who are really important when it comes to closing a deal, and also advisors who support companies if they encounter any issues. So this is very much the money-oriented ecosystem. And the next one, it's taking me a while to get here, but actually in terms of the popularity or frequency of use, the entrepreneur ecosystem is not that common. There is a very little recognition of the fact that actually we can look at an ecosystem also from the peer community perspective. So this ecosystem very much includes entrepreneurs and a little bit of independent mentors and advisors. And these are actually different. Mentors and advisors are, in this sense, are meant as people with previous startup experience, which is different from what my informants would call professional advisors, who are more on the entrepreneurship support ecosystem side. And it's worth mentioning that this is the only perspective which explicitly talks about entrepreneurs as members of the ecosystem and not just mere beneficiaries or customers. And as a result of including entrepreneurs, this is the least formal and least institutionalized view on ecosystems, because all the other ones tend to very much focus on kind of the overall support infrastructure. And finally, we have something, for lack of a better word, I call the sectoral ecosystem, because it is an extension essentially of the standard entrepreneurial ecosystem, which is typically sector agnostic, but it includes a market perspective. It has been argued by my research participants that it's not enough to have general entrepreneurship knowledge, because you also need to make money, you need revenue, and you only get that by actually selling to customers. And that's why it's really important to also include a market or sector-specific understanding of the different actors, regulations, and requirements. And interestingly, it seems that corporate organizations are actually the connectors between these two ecosystems, because there are potential lucrative business customers for startups. And there might also be a way for startups to reach international markets as well. So overall, so these are the 6 ecosystems. It's still work in progress, but I've been wondering, so what? So what do we make of this? And I have a couple of points I'd like to mention. First of all, as I said at the outset, there's very different perceptions of actually constitutes an entrepreneurial ecosystems and who's in or out. It needs to be mentioned, though, that despite the different actors who are involved, all of the sub-ecosystems very much undertake the same function, which is supporting entrepreneurs, but it's in different ways. It can be provision of knowledge, resources, or finances, but at their core, it is indeed support of entrepreneurship. And there are some hints at, indeed, the multi-level and nested and overlapping nature of ecosystems, and we can look at them potentially from the macro, meso, and micro level too. What I'm not too sure about, though, is whether there are any differences in the internal dynamics of these sub-ecosystems and the overall ecosystem, and whether these are similar, are they different, and if so, how? That is something I haven't figured out just yet. The next implication is that Well, the term has an unstable meaning, means lots of different things. And it's also, at least in Scotland, it seems to have been hijacked by the entrepreneurship support infrastructure, where if you say the word ecosystem in Scotland, lots of people immediately think of the support infrastructure. And in a way, this means that entrepreneurs are being excluded from the ecosystem narrative. And they themselves were very skeptical when I tried to talk to them about the ecosystem, because they don't think about it. They don't think about an ecosystem in a way we think about it. For them, it's very much about a community of fellow entrepreneurs. Next up, like I said before, the term is confusing. And as a result, there have been multiple attempts to map the ecosystem and make sense of it. And one very interesting observation from my work was the fact that sometimes when I would ask about the scope of the ecosystem, lots of people would say, well, we determine who is in or out based on who's on the map. And it turns out that Ben Spiegel's diagram from 2015, and I think Ben is on the call, is the Bible for lots of people I spoke to, because they would proudly carry this diagram with them, and they would sometimes even go and point to the diagram and point where exactly on the diagram they are. And it was a matter of pride if they were kind of centrally located. So for them, this seems to be the definition of the ecosystem. But as we all know, mapping, when you start mapping ecosystems, and I'm guilty of that myself, you tend to skew towards formal institutionalized actors, and you tend to overlook the informal meetups and chats that happen between entrepreneurs. And I think this further reinforces the focus on the entrepreneurship support infrastructure. And I even have a really nice quote from one of my participants who said that we don't have a military industrial complex in Scotland, we have an entrepreneurial support industrial complex. And this very much speaks to the idea that it's a self-perpetuating entity, and it's got to a point where it's not only serving the entrepreneurs themselves, but also trying to ensure its own survival. Right, and next up, just a bit of a reflection. So when I thought about the implications, as I said, in Scotland, it is very much support organization centric, whereas in the kind of successful ecosystems, including Silicon Valley, the ecosystem is a lot more entrepreneur-centric. And if we look at the diagram, we can see that these are two very different types of actors who seem to be involved. And it's therefore probably no wonder that in Scotland, we seem to be a little bit public sector heavy, whereas Silicon Valley is a lot more grassroots oriented. So the question then is, what does this mean for the governance dynamic of ecosystems, and the way ecosystems are organized, and who plays a leading role, if anybody, in an ecosystem? And finally, and I'm conscious of time, but just a question for you a little bit, because I've been trying to think of so how can we make sense of this beyond just kind of describing what's happening? And I know that Katarina Shagan is on the call, and she's a massive fan of institutional fields, and we've been having endless discussions about this. And I've been wondering, and it's only a half-baked idea, so please, I would be keen to hear your thoughts. Potentially, could we look at ecosystems as fields? So fields, institutional fields in the literature, are essentially communities of organizations that interact together in a certain way in a recognized area of institutional life. And they tend to focus on a particular issue or a particular domain. And what I like about fields is they highlight the fact that the different actors in an ecosystem interact with one another. There may be coordination taking place. And also there's the fact that it's about having an understanding of the different participants who are part of your field and who are not. And in a way, I wonder if we could look at ecosystems, or maybe just the sub-ecosystems, as fields or issue fields, where we think about them focusing around entrepreneurship support. But if we do this could potentially allow us to look at the dynamic within and between fields, including the different interactions, governance, power hierarchy, and boundaries. It's a very emerging idea, so please let me know if this sounds good, or if it sounds like I'm not on the right track, or if you have any other suggestions on how to actually make sense of this. So in summary, to summarize what I've just been talking about, there's different ways of looking at the term ecosystem, especially in Scotland, and this leads to ambiguity and confusion. So we don't really know what we talk about when we talk about the word ecosystem, because I might be talking about the entrepreneurial ecosystem, but lots of other people actually mean the entrepreneurship support ecosystem, which actually excludes lots of actors. There's also a lot of difference in terms of the balance. In Scotland, we seem to be very support-centric, whereas a lot of other ecosystems might be more entrepreneur-centric. And what does that mean for how we try to build ecosystems? Also, entrepreneurs themselves don't seem to engage with the ecosystem narrative as much, and it might be a reflection of the fact that it's been hijacked by the support infrastructure. And finally, I think this sheds light, but also brings up a lot of questions about the multi-scalar nature of ecosystems, the different levels at which ecosystems operate, and generally the various dynamics that operate within, but also between the different ecosystems. So I'm very keen to hear your thoughts, any feedback, suggestions, or comments you may have, and thank you very much for taking the time to attend the session today.
Thank you, Michaela. Very thought-provoking presentation. I hope there will be quite a few questions from the audience. Maxim?
Thank you. Exciting, and definitely not been hijacked from anywhere, because very original work, and we've definitely learned lots of new things about ecosystem. I very much enjoyed the visualization. So now finally we can kind of see what is the ecosystem, rather than having a conceptual things, but it's actually real, you can see it. It made me a bit think of Brown and Mason taxonomy that they introduced in 2017 paper in Small Business Economics on actors, actors, connectors, financial resource providers, and culture. But I haven't seen the culture in that picture. So maybe it's something related to industrial or sectoral ecosystem, but because of media that can create a certain culture of entrepreneurship, but it was not exactly understood in the culture. Culture is part of institutions. That is maybe something of the pieces of the puzzle that could be missing. And you said, what about institutions? I also like that you compared it to Silicon Valley ecosystem, and we saw that in fact it could be that all these elements actually hold for any ecosystem, for Tokyo or London or New York or a small town in Amazonia. It may hold, but it depends on what focus, depending what that cities are strong in and can build on. Like Silicon Valley is strong in investors' capital and culture, so they would go in the one sub ecosystem. UK is strong in government support to entrepreneurs, and they would go to the support type. Maybe, you know, ecosystem in East Europe would need to look at the other sources of things. But yeah, the question is whether this would hold for many places, and where's a culture missing in that? If it is missing, cultural institutions, where they would be.
Great question. Thank you very much for your comments, Max, and that's really, really appreciated. Well, first of all, yes, culture is a big part of the jigsaw. This was a deliberate look at the actors who have agency, because my understanding is culture is more institutional, so it's part of the broader data that I'm looking at, but it just didn't seem to kind of fit in the puzzle. When it comes to the generalizability of this, I don't know, and I'm not really sure. I actually suspect, more based off a gut feeling, that when I spoke to people who actually did research on Silicon Valley, that for them actually the default ecosystem was almost just what we call the entrepreneur ecosystem, and the rest just happened to be around them. Whereas in Scotland, like I said, it's more about the support infrastructure. So I do suspect that there will be similar instances of sub-ecosystems elsewhere. I do think it might be a bit of a specificity to Scotland, that it's so support oriented. Although when we did this series in Japan, actually back in 2019, and we heard about the Japanese approach, it also seemed to be very public sector driven and almost kind of city council or region or municipalities driven. So I think we can look at these configurations in different ecosystems, and I think it's worth doing. but I don't have the answer to that, but definitely a thought-provoking question.
Thank you. We've got a question from Ben.
Okay, thank you for that. It's incredibly terrifying that people are paying attention to that diagram, which I threw together in about a day, just out of pure boredom.
You have no idea.
That's terrifying, but I will be contacting you about the impact case study. So I'm wondering if there's a problem with focusing too much on the support ecosystem. Again, all of this is about building the economy. High growth firms mean growth, mean good stuff. And I wonder, to the extent that you see divergent goals between the entrepreneurs in their entrepreneurial ecosystem and people running organizations in the support ecosystem. Are there issues with, again, sort of them going for different KPIs, them looking for different things in order to make money or get promoted? Is that an issue?
Yes. That's part of the bigger puzzle. Again, the PhD material, there's lots about different goals and different visions or sense of direction where you want the ecosystems to go. There is a massive difference between the entrepreneurs and everybody else. For entrepreneurs, it's just about, well, for an ecosystem, I just use it when I need it. Otherwise, I stay away from it. My ecosystem is the people who speak the startup language. That's essentially it. And for them, then it's about just embracing the chaos and learning how to do a good job running a business. And then for the support infrastructure, there are elements of kind of wider socio-economic development, the greater good, well-being, etc. So it becomes a bit muddled and a step away from entrepreneurship, definitely. So, and I can see that, and I think there's divergence even among the different individual organizations that I've spoken to, and for some it's about supporting entrepreneurs and actually just being hyper-focused on them. For others, it's, oh yeah, well, entrepreneurship is just part of the answer of what we do. And I do think that sometimes you can see, that might part of the reason might be why we have the Scotland Can Do element, because it's everybody talking about the Scotland Can Do agenda, and then the rest is, oh no, we don't do that because it's too public sector driven. So there's also lots of questions around motivations and why people do what they do. So that's something that's probably another presentation for another day.
Thank you. And we have a question, and around 2 minutes for an answer, 2 to 3 minutes from Matthias.
Hiya. Great talk, Michaela. It's basically following on from Ben, and it's just sort of, I think it's also kind of an introduction, potentially some of the stuff that we were talking about with Fumi later. But I suppose the question is, so if we accept, and we do, I think most of us will accept that a Scottish ecosystem is very much support driven, or this sort of support is like overwhelming almost sometimes in comparison to the amount of actual economic activity.
Yep.
So how do we intervene, right? What is then the mechanism? If you even mentioned entrepreneurs don't even necessarily engage with that. So what is then the mechanism for intervention? Any thoughts about that kind of, so that we are kind of offer something constructive going forward? Because I think we agree with the diagnosis. I think the question is, what can we do about it?
Great question. I'm not entirely sure I have the answer just yet, but my inclination would be, so when I speak to people about, I call them out on the lack of involvement of entrepreneurs. Sometimes, well, their argument is, if we're doing a good job as support organizations, we're actually being representatives of the entrepreneur community, and therefore we don't need them kind of as members. So that was one of those things. And I think actually having these entrepreneur in residence positions, or people who would actually go and call people out when they get too boggled with their KPIs and their different targets that have actually nothing to do with helping entrepreneurs on the ground, that might be one way about it. And I do think we shouldn't just assume that that support organizations are good representatives of entrepreneurs and their communities, but I do think it needs to be a bit of a closer involvement. But on the other hand, the entrepreneurs themselves are not that keen, because for them, a lot of these things are just a talking shop, or why would I get involved? It's just a public sector initiative. It's a waste of my time. Nothing ever changes, nothing ever happens. So I think it's also about the motivations, like I said earlier, being maybe a bit more transparent about kind of what we want to get out of it, both sides, and a closer engagement. And I really think listening to entrepreneurs a bit more, so that they realize it's truly for them, and it's not just, we're not just saying it, but it actually is the case as well.
Thank you, Michaela. Thank you for all the questions. This was great.